Hello, and welcome to another episode of Mobile Technology Spotlight, sponsored by T-Mobile for Government and presented by Public Safety Insight. T-Mobile is committed to supporting first responders and helping public safety use technology as a force multiplier. I'm Dale Stockton, and today I'll be talking with Scott Bennett, who is Cradlepoint's Exec Director for Carrier Business Development for T-Mobile. I met Scott at the IACP conference in San Diego, and he's got almost 30 years of experience dealing with wireless technologies and a great deal of technology knowledge regarding the growing use of routers in public safety. That's why he's with us today. So let's turn to Scott. Thanks so much for being with us today. And how about if you kick us off with just sharing a bit about you and the company that you work for, Cradlepoint?
Dale, appreciate it. Thank you very much. I was getting ready for this. I was thinking about it. 10 years ago, about 10 years ago, between 9 and 10, we sold Cradlepoint IBR 1100s to City of Richmond. So if you kind of start from there, move forward, there's been a lot of change. And that's what we're going to deep dive into for the rest of this conversation. But that's where I started. I've done everything from carriers to machine to IoT, to startups, the whole 9 yards, and have been at Cradlepoint now for 3 years. And my gig at Cradlepoint is to run the day-to-day between us and T-Mobile. So for all segments, but when I sold those IBRs, I was at Sprint back in the day. So I've been doing public safety and machine for public safety for, like I said, about 9-10 years.
All right. Well, let's jump right into the router discussion, like a router 101. I think probably most folks have a baseline awareness of what a router does in their home, but this show's about mobile technology. Could you provide an explanation of why most public safety vehicles now have a router and what that router does?
Yeah. So just think of the police cruiser today and all that it does. I always use the example of the reason a police officer can be so efficient at pulling you over for a old car tag is he doesn't have to hit that potato mic and call you in anymore. He's going to have an ALPR camera on that bull bar, and it's going to read every single car that's driving by. The MDT that's sitting inside of the cab, if it's sitting there green, everything's fine. It'll pop up red. That means that car just came by. It's got a bad car tag. So that's just one example of the type of technology that's sitting inside a police cruiser. So you got that. You got sensors on when the blue lights come on. You got sensors on when the gun safe gets opened. You've got body-worn cameras. You've got that connectivity for the MDT. All of that requires a router that has security and networking capabilities inside of it that let you control how that network functions. That's why you see folks putting in a router. It's interesting because police cruisers tend to be an example of where first responders are actually ahead of their peers in enterprise. If you see a box truck or Sprinter van on the road, that may not actually have a router sitting inside of it, but most police cruisers do. And at the end of the day, it is the most mission critical job out there. And that's why you've seen these folks adopt this technology, because their need to stay connected at all times is as important or higher and more important than anybody else who's on the road.
You kind of touched on this, but let's take it up a notch. Some agencies rely on some type of a hotspot approach for connectivity in the field, and you just emphasize how important routers are. So contrast that hotspot approach with using a router. What are the advantages that the router provides?
Yeah. Hey, and like I said, when I was at Sprint, we sold hotspots. So I get that. And it really kind of comes down to, what are you after? If you're just after a connection, you don't care about the security on top of it. You don't care about controlling it. There's nothing about the manageability that you're interested in. You just want access to T-Mobile's 5G network. I get that. That's a hotspot. Now, for obvious reasons, hotspots are going to die. They're going to blow up in Florida. When they get hot, they're going to expand. They're not something that can sit inside of a police cruiser for 5 to 7 years. So you'll hear us talk about TCO, total cost of ownership. So as you start looking at it and the amount of times that you have to touch a cruiser to get everything inside of it, you really start trying to figure out what's the best way for me to put something in that's future-proofed, so I don't need to go touch it, at least from a network perspective. And as you kind of go down that path, that pushes you down the path of a router. So the other thing with the hotspots, there's no security sitting on top of it. So you could get it security through one of the peripherals that's getting into the hotspot, but security, next-gen firewall, zero trust, those types of principles matter as much to police officers as they do to a Fortune 50 retailer. So what we enable with these routers is you can take some of these SD-WAN traffic steering solutions and services that are maybe kind of commonplace inside of retail and apply that to a mobile environment on the road. So if those things matter to you, that pushes you down the path of a router. If those things don't matter to you, it pushes you down the path of a hotspot.
Great answer. Great explanation. Thanks. What about the move to 5G? What are you seeing in terms of trends? Are agencies starting to make that move?
Yeah, no doubt. Almost everything that we've got on the road is still LTE. We've been selling 5G now for about 2.5 years, and this will probably be the first year where you see the predominant amount of devices going out as 5G. So it's like all transitions from 1G, 2G, 3G, all of them take a second. 5G has moved quicker than maybe it feels like. And the real driver would be the video that's out there. So think of how much video is there. I talked about an ALPR camera. You got forward facing cameras, you got body worn cameras. How much video is there? And if not an absolute need for the individual cruiser on a normal day, think of emergency response. The main thing that we hear back from agencies is when there is a substantial event and there's a very large concentration of response in a small geographic area. That's when the congestion that you would normally see from an LTE starts really cropping up. And that's when you really have to make sure it's tapped down the most, because those events are substantially more sensitive than maybe just the normal. So if you kind of think of it from those aspects, 5G, how much camera are you relying on? And what happens when you have multiple agencies, 10, 15 people responding, and they're all sitting in the same spot? There's a lot of cameras. There's a lot there. You need to maintain connectivity for first responders. 5G is the way to do it.
So, notwithstanding the compelling case you just made, what would you say to the IT manager that says, but we've got really great 4G coverage. It's meeting all of our needs. I don't think there's a reason to switch to 5G. What are they missing beyond what you just said?
More than likely, it's probably about future proofing. And I get it. If you look at it today and say, hey, I've got excess capacity, I don't necessarily need 5G for my body worn cameras to function. But again, it kind of goes back to how often do you want to touch these cruisers? The other thing that we know emphatically, and probably not as great of an example for public safety, but it applies across the board, is all of these generations from carriers, all these next gen networks provide and produce something out of that which no one predicted. So the easiest example that everyone's heard a billion times is Uber, right? No one knew that Uber was going to disrupt the cab industry to the degree it did, but it needed 4G, it needed GPS, it needed some basic functionality in order to enable that, but you couldn't predict it. What we're seeing right now, we're at the really, really early stages of this, but what I would tell you, the tip of the spear that's driving some 5G conversations right now is turning into AI. When you start understanding how AI can be applied inside of public safety, you're starting to get to a situation where there is a substantial amount of bandwidth that needs access to the data, where the data can be computed in order for the AI to function. So you got that. And one thing I haven't touched on would be smart cities. When you start thinking of, hey, I may not actually have as many cruisers on the street that I did 10 years ago. So okay, I'm reducing my need of 5G in the police cruiser. That's being augmented with 5G at traffic intersections. So again, it gets back to cameras. So you start understanding how much camera compute can be at a traffic intersection, and folks are using that to augment the police officer on the street, the police officer in the cab of the cruiser. You're seeing another example of why people are going, well, it's 5G, because again, I need to do some level of edge compute. It's not just streaming. I'm trying to think through and make some determinations out there on the edge. All of those things are pushing you down a 5G path.
5G itself, I know router and some of the analytics that you can look at and programs like NetMotion, you begin to be aware of bandwidth and data speeds. What are you seeing? And is it a dramatic difference for the user experience?
When folks hear me talk publicly, what I always focus on is that T-Mobile's network is not just 10 or 20% better. T-Mobile's network can be factors faster, and not just faster, relative also to latency, and not just downlink, but uplink. If you start, and that's kind of what Creditpoint says, is that our hardware just works. That's the brand that we have all the way back to that example I talked about, IBR 1100s. We just work. We've done a really good job of taking that foundation and layering on top software that enables folks to do neat things and provide solutions that maybe 10 years ago you were not going to be able to actually do that a mobile environment. So when you kind of combine that with what I was talking about a second ago on the IoT side of it, and you combine it with NetMotion, what you start understanding is you need to maintain connectivity. In our world, that also includes putting in another modem. I alluded to earlier about being first responders and having the number one mission critical need to have connectivity out there. That also plays out in, well, do I actually need two SIMs and one modem, or should I actually put a second modem inside of it? And that is a function of kind of what we're getting to. Where are you from a smart city perspective? Where are you from a police cruiser perspective? And you're starting to make these decisions based upon where you are as an agency locally.
That's a great segue. We're going to hit on that dual SIM, dual modem in just a minute. But first, let's talk about why that's important. Agencies are concerned about having failover capability. Could you explain what that term means and then the role of the router in making that happen?
I jumped the shark on that one, right? So failover means that there's more than one connection, backhaul, whatever you want to call it. There's more than one connection back to the internet. You can, back to that hotspot we were talking about earlier, that's going to be a single point of connection back to the internet. When we say failover, we're talking about the router itself having redundancy. So there's two ways I talked about it. So every router we sell in first responders has two SIM slots sitting inside of it. I talked about software being our focus. Providing traffic steering and SD-WAN functionality is really our claim to fame. And taking that and applying it to mobile is why folks look at Cradlepoint as an option now versus maybe some of the other folks that they used to look at, because you need to maintain it. You mentioned NetMotion. So NetMotion is going to do that session persistence sitting over the top. So that is a way to ensure that you continue the connection. But if you really hop between, and not every network, no network is perfect. And you're always going to get into the variances between, well, we're on the same cell site, but we're tweaked differently. Our antennas are not in the exact same design. And they're just between that and between, hey, it's at a river, man. We're just in between two hills. We're going to lose connection here. Well, that may not be true on another network because of how the antennas are tweaked, because of where another cell site is. So the first step to that is, well, then just put two SIMs inside of it. I got a modem. I can run two SIMs. That is an answer. It takes a hot second to move from one SIM to the next. So usually we see folks more in retail. Think about it from a point of sale perspective. If you lose connectivity for 10 to 15 seconds in between running a transaction, the world's not going to come to an end. Well, in first responders, it may. So that's when we start talking about the dual modem. So if we go, look, if you can't wait that long, and not to get into the weeds of the why there's a difference, but you got to have firmware set up. So if you've got two modems, I can have firmware for one network and firmware for another up at the same time. So NetCloud is doing this in analytics and saying, hey, throughput, signal strength, something just dropped. I need to proactively move off of this modem over to the next one. First responder guys are the ones who go, look, that's what I need. Now, it's always going to be a function of cost and funding because there's more money to go down that path. But that is the best case scenario, is when you have a router, it's rugged, it just works, it does all those other things we were talking about. Then you turn around and go, okay, I got it, got the software on top, got it. Now I need to make sure I stay connected. I got NetMotion sitting there. That fourth example, what I just rattled through, would be putting a second modem inside of it, standing up the firmware and being able, it's not sub-second, but it's extremely quick. It's usually quick enough that the police officer doesn't even know that the router has bounced between the two. And that's really what you want. You want NetMotion kind of being that bridge and gluing it, and you just never see it because all the software, everything behind the curtain is working so well.
Great explanation. Now, clearly, capabilities like dual SIM and dual modem come with an added cost. but dual modem is significantly more than dual SIM, if I remember our conversation from ICP. But you also mentioned put it in the perspective of long term, you're paying for two carriers, you may need this capability. Add to that explanation, if you would.
One of the things we were talking about is I use the non-technical term. It's not cheap. So it's going to be $500-$600 to put in what we call an MC400 5G. Let's think of it from a hardware perspective, just super quick. There are options for the agency to look at. So if you've already bought 4G and you've got that router, more than likely with us, it's an IBR 1700. Maybe it's a 900, but it's probably a 1700. Point is, the 1700 got a open slot today to put that MC400 modem in. So that could be one of your easier ways to move forward. That IBR 1700 is just 2 years old, 3 years old. It can last another 3 or 4 years. So you don't necessarily want to do a rip and replace. But everything we've gone through relative to, hey, I actually do want to get to the 5G network, I could put an MC400 into that. So 500 to 600, then it's not quite as painful because you're adding to a CapEx that you've already put into the ground, so to speak. Now, another option for us, instead of doing a second modem, would be this R2100 that we launched earlier in the year. And that is extremely unique to the space. And what it's really doing, we hadn't talked about antennas, but an IBR 17 or whatever's in the trunk, you got it connected to an antenna that's on the roof. So panorama, parsec, you got something outside, 6-in-1, you got all the cabling going in that drill hole so that you get the signal out of the trunk. And that's just what the answer has been for 15, 20 years. And what we did at Cradlepoint was we combined those two things and we put the modem under the same piece of plastic as the antenna. Kind of sort of looks like a larger version of a shark fin. So my point is, instead of necessarily putting in an MC400, which you could to the 1700, you could actually put the entire thing on the roof of the cruiser. And the reason that matters is from an RF perspective, you're always going to have some loss. Now, if you're running 6 to 8 to 10 feet of cable inside the cruiser, that's not crazy loss. There's some, but you can live with it. It's certain you have a net gain from the dBs by putting something outside. But what if you could actually put the modem and the processor literally within an inch, 2 inches of the actual antennas? That is the number one best way to access the T-Mobile 5G network, that solution. So now you got options. So again, if you've got an IBR 1700, you could say, all right, I do want to go down this T-Mobile path. I could put a modem inside, which is a less costly answer versus saying, no, I'm going to put that 2105 out. And it is not only going to act as a 5G connection, but all that cellular intelligence that we have sitting in that cloud. We've talked a lot about security, a lot about the manageability and traffic steering, but cellular intelligence is kind of how we grew up, meaning what's the quality of that RF? What's the signal like? Can I shape how I use the peripherals inside of the cruiser based upon what those measurements are? And all that sits inside of cellular intelligence. So that's the difference between putting an antenna on the outside and putting this adapter. So that's a kind of super long-winded way of saying there are options once you start going, I've got existing deployment and I'm trying to figure out the best way for me to take that existing deployment and get to the 5G network from T-Mobile. There's really three things. Just throw a SIM in there. And if you've got 5G already there, all right, go. But it'll be now you have two SIMs on a single modem. All right, don't want to do that. I want another modem because I have on 4G. Okay, got it. That's one way. Or I want the best RF experience possible. And that's where we'll put that 2100 on the roof.
The different methodologies of, as you said, getting there, I assume when you engage with someone at Cradle Point, they can take and do an assessment of where you are today, where you want to get to, and figure the most cost-effective way to pull it off.
That is exactly why we use partners. A lot of this takes some level of expertise. So we've got 2,000 partners out there, and a lot of them are focused on public safety. Everything's relative in life. If you're an agency who's had Cradlepoint for the last 10 years and you know everything about NetCloud, you may say, hey, I want T-Mobile just to sell that to me. Because everything I rattle through, T-Mobile's got on T-Mobile's paper. T-Mobile can sell it to you as an agency. If you're going, well, hold on, I'm actually a competing shop, or I've been doing hotspots the whole time. I don't know NetCloud like this. We highly, highly recommend. And that's what our guys would do, Dale, is going, hey, based upon where you are and what you're after, these are the 2 or 3 partners that really understand your space. So that's what I would tell you is it's all about your journey and how familiar you are already with NetCloud. Super familiar, just get it from T-Mobile and let your guys do what they're going to do. Not as familiar, let's bring in a partner and help you get to launch.
Got it. In a general sense, if you're an IT manager, a fleet manager, and this whole router thing is kind of Greek to you, what would be your recommendation for where they could get more information and the things they know about or need to know about purchasing?
So number one, we haven't touched very much on the fact that Ericsson has owned us now for 3 years. And that matters a lot. Maybe some of the technical reasons that are behind the curtain. But one reason that matters and answers this question, we've got a lot of feet on the street now. We always had a good sized organization. Now we have a really large organization in North America. So that's the first thing, is making sure that we get you to what we call a regional sales manager who's in your patch of grass, who lives next to you and is talking. It's kind of what we did with Johns Creek PD whenever we were at IACP, was had that conversation, had people in the booth, and we're able to extend that conversation back. So that's the first thing. The next thing is, that's part of what my gig is at Creditpoint, is helping evangelize and get this knowledge transferred to the T-Mobile rep. So Dave Bezant's got this organization. He's got a lot of folks out there whose feet on the street. So between those two, that conversation is going to lead to what we said a second ago, and understanding where are you? Do we need to bring in a partner? Because folks like Step CG, Hyperion, RCN, those guys live and breathe this all day long. And in our world, in the Creditpoint world, we don't sell to the end user. We don't provide managed services. We look to partners. We give partners the tools to be able to do those things. So it really does matter based upon what your experience level is. And so either come to us and we'll go down the path, or go to T-Mobile. Between one of those two, we'll go find out what's needed in order to get you to motion.
Before we close this out, Scott, a thought occurs to me. A lot of what we've talked about, or at least the way I was hearing it, was from a kind of a law enforcement paradigm, but increasingly fire apparatus has a lot of technology in it. I assume routers are just as important on that side. Can you speak to that?
Exactly. Yeah, I would say fire apparatus. Everything changed for us really during the pandemic. And again, kind of back to Ericsson, one of the advantages that we had during the pandemic was everybody had supply issues. Well, we didn't have them remotely as bad as anybody else. I won't say that we did not ship everything within 24 hours. We were way closer to that than almost anybody. And fire was one of the departments that we probably were not as close to before the pandemic, but now we are. So it started for just the basic reason of what I just said. We had gear. Other folks didn't have gear. They couldn't get anything out. But what that has led us to is, you're spot on. The fire apparatus, they're not exactly the same needs, but functionally from a router perspective, they are. So when I was rattling through ALPR cameras and forward facing and all that, you got the same things relative to the fire, the pumper trucks, all the different types of trucks. One of the things I learned 10 years ago is you kind of just think there's a fire truck. Well, that's not true. There's about 6 or 7 different types, which is why the apparatus term is used. So pressure monitoring, water, all of that, we can censor those things and be able to let them understand how that truck is performing while it's away from the station. Everyone knows fire. They know what's happening in that station. They've got that routine. Our ability is to allow them to stay just as connected once that truck leaves, and understand how it's functioning so that it's functioning as premium as it can once it gets to an event.
Excellent. Well, I'll tell you what, every time I talk with you, I learn a lot. And I will admit there's quite a bit to learn about routers, but it's important stuff. So I just want to tell you, thank you. I know people benefit from this sharing of information. Today's episode of Mobile Technology Spotlight has been sponsored by T-Mobile for Government and presented by Public Safety Insight. Stay safe out there, everyone.